We had a little neighborhood get together for the 900 block of St. Charles yesterday, just because so many new people moving in just to get them. So it was the turnout really nice. It started raining a little bit after church.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, I miss it. But anyway,
Had it at your house?
no, it was at the neighbor's house across the street because the back off the flat.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice,
Very nice.
yeah.
There's a duplex for sale, I think, near you.
You saw with the house in the corner of your block, so in right there at the intersection of Watson and St. Charles.
No, oh, is it like a gray one?
Yeah, it's one Stan Taylor used to. It's right there in the corner as you come up to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's right, 2025.
Good, how are you, sir?
I looked at a database of, from Keith Smith of 142 houses in Charlottesville that sold in the last, in this calendar year. 69 sold for more than the list price. 19
Yeah.
sold for the list price.
You can, Sean Tubbs has a good regular update of the properties sold, and it's almost always that.
All but one or two of the 142 sold for more than the assessed value.
Yeah, the one across from me, it was 525, it's a 2.
Are we ready to go?
We're ready to go.
All right. So I will call this meeting of the Charlottesville City Council to order. We're doing this as a hybrid meeting. We are here live and in person in City Council chambers, but the 4 o'clock meeting here we will do basically with people just appearing by Zoom. So if folks are watching on Zoom, that's as good as it's going to get for a couple hours. Ms. Thomas, will you call the roll?
Councilor Hill,
Present.
Councilor Payne,
Here.
Councilor Pinkston,
Here.
Mayor Snook,
Here.
Vice Mayor Wade.
Here.
Okay, we're all here. Is there a motion to approve or to amend the agenda?
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, motion passes. We have an agenda. So the meeting will be divided into 3 main sections. The first is a work session to hear and discuss presentations. The second will be followed by a closed meeting to discuss a few matters that mainly legal significance. Then the City Council business meeting, which will start around 6:30 with limited in-person public seating. And if, of course, you're welcome to participate by Zoom in any case. So those are our 3 pieces. Here at the 4 o'clock hour, we have 2 reports on the agenda. The first one is from the Thomas Jefferson Area Coalition for the Homeless, aka TJAC. And I think we have Executive Director of TJAC, Anthony Harrow, to present to us. Is that right? Yes. Mr. Harrow?
Thank
We
you
can
for
see
having
you.
me, councilors and Mr. Mayor. It's good to be here. And I wanted to, talk about homelessness in Charlottesville and the surrounding areas. And I have a little presentation I'd like to share with you all.
Great.
So I guess I should share my screen if that's okay. Or you can put the presentation up. It looks like sharing is disabled for me.
That's somebody else's department.
Hi, Anthony. You should have the ability now. I just made you a co-host.
Oh, there we go. Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Can you see that?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So again, my name is Anthony Harrow. I'm the director for the Thomas Jefferson Area Coalition for the Homeless, and we are the COC lead agency on homelessness, which is essentially a HUD term for a continuum of care, which is defined as the community of service providers addressing homelessness in particular communities. Our COC area, or our service area that TJAC covers and works within, includes the city of Charlottesville, county of Albemarle, and also the counties of Louisa, Fluvanna, Nelson, and Greene counties. So to begin, I wanted to just start off with some baselines, which is that TJAC, we believe everyone deserves a safe place to call home. We believe it's a human right. And we also believe that housing is the end to homelessness. This is a simple math problem that I love to always go back to as a good reminder. Every time I get an opportunity to talk about homelessness, I think this is important and can't be said enough. But homelessness plus home or housing equals not homeless any longer. And so I'll hit on that a little bit later in the presentation, but that's something that's core to our mission and core to our belief, and I'll show in the data how that also manifests as well locally with homelessness. Another kind of just foundational thing I wanted to talk about was that the way we see homelessness also locally and nationwide is that it's a part of a system, it's a part of a greater force in our community. And this quote, I think, is really impactful for many different sectors or many different, parts of society in our community, but that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And so in the context of homelessness, I think this is important for me to think about as the executive director for the coalition leader on homelessness is how do we move forward properly so that our system, both the homeless service system, but also all the systems that we're interconnected with, how can we be aligned and how do we have the right resources to reach our goal? And so, in the absence of that, basically it says that we don't have the right resources and supports necessary to reach our goal of making homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. And that homelessness is a symptom of a system that doesn't have enough of those different resources or enough of those different avenues for people to move out of homelessness properly and get stabilized. So that's also a core belief of how we approach homelessness locally. So just as a foundational portion of how we look at homelessness and how we look at solving it. And now I want to talk about local homelessness here in the city. Recently, we worked on a outreach project called the Point in Time Count. Some of you might be familiar with that. I know some counselors have experience working directly in homeless services, but the Point in Time Count is a nationwide effort to document the size and scope of homelessness. And we rely on volunteers and also staff in the homeless system of care and also in other human services to go out into the community and actually talk with and interview people experiencing homelessness. And so we just finished that project in January of this year. Every year we do it in January with the goal of trying to identify folks at a time where we're hoping most people are in sheltered settings because of the weather. But we go out in January and talk to folks. And so I wanted to talk about that data here with you. I know this might be far away from you as counselors. I'm not sure how well you can see these numbers. I know they're small, and I'm happy to share this with you all afterwards as well. But this is a representation of the point in time count over the last 12 years, starting in 2010. We've had pretty consistent methodology with the count, and we've documented it as a part of our requirement to HUD. We've reported on these numbers for the past, since 2010. And as you can see how it changes over time, but you can see there's been a significant shift lately from 2021 to 2022, the count we just completed in January. The blue line at the top is the count, of people in emergency shelters in our community. And then there are two lines below that are a little bit hard to distinguish. I apologize about the colors. One of them is orange. That's the count of people in transitional housing in our community. We have very limited transitional housing in our community. And then the last line is yellow, which represents people living unsheltered or not in emergency shelters. So essentially camping outside, sleeping under bridges, or sleeping in their car. And so to start with real quick, just to give an overview of what this blue line is showing is, definitely some changes over time since 2010. But again, the most significant shift has just occurred over this past year. And it's directly related to the pandemic and also things that the pandemic has brought with it, like high housing costs and lack of available affordable housing. And I'll talk a bit more about how it affects that, but we are experiencing quite a unique time in the homeless system of care now, as you can see, where this sheltered count is quite high, higher than it's ever been before. And it's, again, directly related to the pandemic. As some of you might be familiar, when the pandemic first started in 2020, we moved from largely a congregate shelter setting to a non-congregate shelter setting, meaning people have their own private rooms in local hotels. And then we were able to be a part of a really amazing partnership to purchase an old motel and then renovate it into a emergency shelter, non-congregate emergency shelter. And that data is represented here as well. But we had to extend even beyond that. And so we had folks also in local hotels on top of that. And so you can see that there were 260 people living in emergency shelters in January 2022. There was 27 people we identified as sleeping outside, and there were 5 people in transitional housing. So that was our point in time count. And the other significant thing I wanted to bring up about homelessness locally is that the unsheltered number, the number of people living outside, has really remained unchanged in a significant way since 2010. Moving between 20 to around 30 people. And still, again, in 2022, in January, we identified almost the same number of people we've identified over the past 10 years. And what that says is really, really important for us as a community and for TJEC to really grapple with. And basically what it says is there is a group of people living outside in our community that we have not significantly been able to address because those numbers have remained essentially unchanged for years and years, even though the other numbers in our community have changed quite a lot. As you can see, this unsheltered number, thankfully it isn't growing as far as we can, as far as our point in time count numbers show. But homelessness is definitely different. And I'm sure many of you have experienced that as well directly firsthand in your own ways. So that's the point in time count overview. This is the point in time count numbers collapsed. So just all in total. And again, you can see how this January was really a historic count for us in this community where the number was significantly larger, driven by the significant increase in number of people in emergency shelters in our community.
Could I ask you to go back to the last slide just a second? Mm-hmm.
Sure.
What is transitional housing?
Great
Give
question.
me some examples.
So locally, transitional housing, the one essential transitional housing program we have is the MACA Hope House. Mm-hmm. And it's a relatively small program for families with children. What transitional housing is defined as for this context is essentially a place for people to stay for up to 2 years with support services, but it is not permanent housing. So it kind of is in the, in between shelter and housing as transitional housing. So it is something that a family or an individual must move out of eventually, but has a longer stay traditionally than emergency shelter, if that makes sense.
So is there a distinction, a set number of days, weeks, months for emergency shelters after which they either have to move into transitional housing or move out?
Great question. Locally, we do not support those types of mandates on time frame. We with the funding that we have, that we fund emergency shelter programs locally, we strive for as few barriers as possible to accessing emergency shelter and also for staying sheltered. And so we do not impose time frames. However, case management is always involved in emergency shelter programs. And as a part of that case management, we are always encouraging and working with clients to help them move on as soon as possible. But there is not a hard stop for the programs we serve or fund.
I'd also like to point out that in this 2011 to 2016 data, during that time, the Salvation Army used to run a transitional housing program, and MACA's Hope House was significantly larger. During those times, the transitional housing shrunk quite largely, and I know MACA, I believe, had to sell a housing unit.
So,
Yeah, as I mentioned, you can see like the numbers from 60 down to essentially
Yeah,
just a handful.
the
of
reason
folks.
those numbers are going down is not because there's not a need, it's because it's
no supply.
no supply. Exactly. I just wanted to make sure that's clarified here.
And
Thank you.
I guess what's striking to me is looking at the unsheltered population, and you pointed out that it remains remarkably constant over the last 12, 13 years. Has there been any difference in resources that have been available to help the unsheltered population?
There have,
Or perhaps to put it another way, resources that help people who are presently unhoused, who might under other circumstances be housed either in an emergency or transitional housing.
Right. There have been changes over time to the resources we have available to address all types of homelessness, and chronic or / unsheltered homelessness is certainly one of them. The main tool in our toolbox to address unsheltered homelessness and people living outside, traditionally, most of whom are considered chronically homeless, and I can define that. I find that a little bit later in the presentation, but I'm happy to talk about it now. But the main tool in our toolbox is permanent supportive housing to really address chronic homelessness properly. And we have had changes in permanent supportive housing available in our community over time. But since the crossings opened, downtown, we haven't had any new injection of permanent supportive housing in a significant way since then. So it's become kind of stagnant, as it were, in terms of the resources available to really address chronic homelessness. And the other really key component to address unsheltered homelessness is street outreach programs. And so we have street outreach through the PATH program at Region 10, which is focused on people living outside with mental health and or substance abuse issues. And but those resources haven't really changed significantly in a long time to really,
There's also some significant, so I think most people know I worked for Potcham for 4 years, and my job is now 4 people's job, which is pretty awesome. But some of the gentlemen, and I'm using gentlemen in general because I ran into more unsheltered men than I ran into unsheltered women. And so I'm going to use the male population on this, that there were a number of gentlemen, some barriers that would come into play would be IDs. And there were some people who I tried very hard, and I know others were working with very hard to try to bring them in. However, congregate settings for some people are incredibly difficult to be around. I remember some of our veterans had a very hard time. Veterans who especially had served in Vietnam or in Afghanistan would have a hard time, and the PTSD in being in congregate shelter, and chose rather to be outside. There were a few people who we couldn't get housing for because all of the housing requires some sort of legal ID. And getting an ID is incredibly difficult.
Since 9/11, you just got to have some.
There was a gentleman we worked for 2 years to get his ID. And this was somebody who we actually had living relatives, and he knew where he was born. And there were a few people who I worked with who they wouldn't even engage in a governmental system to get the paperwork because their mental health issues were so extensive that technically they weren't a threat to themselves or others, but at the same time, they weren't interested in getting housing because housing meant they needed to get papers, and they didn't want to get papers. These are some of the barriers that and albeit the biggest barrier is lack of housing and lack of a place and a rental unit that will accept somebody regardless of what criminal history they might have and regardless of what credit check they might have. This is a very real thing, is that landlords legally can run a credit check. And when you run a credit check, if you've been homeless, I really doubt your credit's good. So I just bringing those issues up here.
Thank you, Counselor. Those are great points. The barriers to housing are real. It's already difficult to identify and move into affordable housing, but it's even more difficult if you've been homeless for a while and don't really have rental history, have a poor credit score, like you mentioned. So those are really important, real factors that we face. Okay, so as you can see, again, just going over the last big count, a significant shift that because of how we're sheltering people and also the numbers of people we're sheltering is increased significantly. Just a little bit about who this population was, who was homeless during January in 2022. In terms of gender, about 70% identified as male, 29% identified as female, 1% identified as transgender, and because of how we code the data with HUD's data set, and also because the numbers are so small, I don't want to reveal the specific type of transgender, whether it's from male or female, because the numbers are too small. It could potentially identify. And so also there was 1% who identified as no single gender. Our belief is that those numbers are artificially low because we don't have programs in our area that are specifically tailored for people who are transgender or non-binary. And so traditionally, a lot of other communities, what they've found is that to really address the needs in that population with homelessness, you need programs that are specifically catered to it. So I would just want to provide that context that probably is an undercount of the true number of people, the numbers of people who deal with homelessness who identify as transgender or non-binary. And then in terms of household makeup, during that point in time, which again was just one day, so it is quite limited, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, but on that night, it just so happened that 98% of the people we identified as homeless were individuals, where 2% of the people we identified were people in families. In terms of age ranges, you can see towards the right, 55 to 61, and then 62 and above. Those were the most populated, or above 55 is the most populated age group in the homeless population. So it is, generally speaking, an aging population dealing with significant health issues, very, very significant health issues. And I mean that physical health, chronic health conditions, and in addition to mental health issues as well, but physical health issues is really a growing trend that we are seeing along with age. In terms of race, 52% identified as white and 41% identified as Black or African American, significantly overrepresented in the homeless population compared to the general population, but also compared to the population of folks who are living in poverty too. 41% is significant overrepresentation. And then in terms of the other population category, again, those numbers were, the number of people were so small, but it includes people who identified as American Indian, Alaskan Native, or Pacific Islander. A little bit more about folks who were homeless during the pit count. There were 12 veterans experiencing homelessness, which for us is actually quite a bright spot in our efforts to end homelessness in general, but also focus on veteran homelessness. We used to traditionally have about 20 to 25 veterans who are homeless in our community. We got as low as 6 for a while. We're at 12 right now, but we are making some great progress with veteran homelessness locally, and this is a result of that. 20% of adults reported experiencing domestic violence at some point in their past. 32% of adults reported mental health concerns, and 57%, almost 60% of the population of people we identified as homeless reported a chronic health condition or physical disability. So again, very significant health issues in the homeless population. Now, these are all self-reported, just for context. This is not verified through medical records, but this is self-reported.
So I'm sorry, just a quick point on the previous slide. I thought that there was significant funding for to house veterans, over the last few administrations, and I'm just curious, the 57% of adults, having some type of health conditions, a lot of time that is what drives them to homelessness if they, they can't pay their bills, and that requires them to. So anyway, it may be, I'm sure it's a correlation there somehow, but concerning the veterans, is there a pot of money specifically? I know that in my world for careers and jobs that there's funding specifically for veterans, so.
Yes, it's a great question. Thank you. And there is special set aside pots of money for veterans experiencing homelessness from the VA, including the VASH program, which is VA supportive housing, and also the SSVF program, which is supportive services for veteran families. And both of those programs have made a huge impact on the veteran homeless population. A lot of the difficulty that we're experiencing right now, even though, because money essentially isn't the issue for veterans. And it's also not necessarily the issue for lots of other people experiencing homelessness, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But the issue, as Councilor McGill said, is the biggest barrier is finding places for people to move into, and also finding places that people are eligible for. Even though, because we do, in many cases, all these veterans have access to funding to help them move into housing. But it doesn't mean it's easy to get there, so.
And vouchers don't pay first and last month's rent, like many landlords demand. They also don't pay a security deposit.
That's a great point too, and that can be a barrier for many people. However, we do have pretty robust programs for veterans to make sure that those are paid, and we do have also pretty robust programs for other people experiencing homelessness to make sure those are paid as well if someone does get access to a voucher. So it is a really important barrier, but we've been able to overcome that barrier. Really, one of the biggest ones, again, is even just finding a place.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I also know with veterans, I don't know if, again, sometimes we had to work with somebody to get their discharge corrected.
Yes,
a lot of
correct.
times a veteran, somebody who considers themselves a veteran and in all reality is a veteran, they were either dishonorably discharged or discharged other. And a lot of that, again, Vietnam era and some others, the VA started relaxing, and you can go back and get your discharge looked at and get it reassessed, because unless you were honorably discharged, you're not eligible for any VA benefits.
Yep.
So that's another issue.
You. And so I just want to move into another really important point about homelessness being dynamic. So I just spoke to you about the numbers of people we identified during the point in time count, but it's very limited, a very important data set. It's a snapshot in time. It's the best way to think about it. But another important aspect of homelessness is that it is dynamic and it changes significantly over time. This data that I have in front of you shows two lines. The top line is the number of people who were literally homeless, meaning that they were, staying in shelters, or we identified that they were living outside over a year. And so, as you can see, that number has changed quite a bit over the years. Significant increase starting in about 2013, all the way up to a height in 2018. 571 people came through our homeless system of care to receive services in some form or the other, who were literally homeless, as opposed to the bottom line, which is the number of people who are homeless at a point in time. And so you can see the difference there, right? At a point in time, it might have been, 188, but over a year, I think it's important to juxtapose that with homelessness is dynamic, and the numbers over a year are quite different and quite significantly larger.
Mr. Harrow?
So yes.
So the numbers at the top in the blue line, are those cumulative? So like if you're tracking throughout the year in 2018, they tracked a total of 571 persons who were homeless over the course of the year versus the point in time in January of that year. Is that the difference?
Yes, that's right. That's a better way of saying it.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, so take 2018, 571 people received services in our system of care for shelter or any other program for specifically for people living, who are homeless, literally homeless, as opposed to the bottom line, which is 165, which is the number of people we identified during the PIT count in January. So just to show how those differ over time. And one thing I wanted to draw your attention to is that when the orange line doesn't increase, but the blue line is increasing, one way to read that is that our system of care is quite efficient at receiving someone who's in crisis, a housing crisis, but that those people are not remaining homeless over time because the orange line is not increasing in a significant way. That's a very positive thing. That means our system of care was able to help a lot of people, but they were able to not stay homeless in our system of care because that orange line is not increasing at the same rate that the blue line is increasing. One thing I want to draw your attention to is 2019, that number dropped significantly from 563 to 450. And that's when the pandemic hit, right? And you can see how clearly that had an impact on homelessness. And part of the reason for that is that, there was moratorium on evictions, there was stay-at-home orders, everyone kind of just stayed where they were. And many people didn't become homeless as a result, which was a very positive thing, obviously. But that was a bit of a bubble, and you can see that finally in 2021, and then during that PIT count in January of 2022, we are seeing a lot more effects finally come to bear on the homeless system of care, where that number is increasing, both for the number of people homeless at a point in time, but also for the numbers of people who have come over a whole year. So I just wanted to show how that looks and how the pandemic has essentially affected homelessness and how that appears in our data set as well. Obviously the goal is for that orange line to keep trending downward, and it's trending upward since last year. So another important aspect about homelessness over time is that most people, and this was true for last year, 68% of people who came through our homeless system of care, so that's the number there, 528 people, 68% of those reported that it was their first time experiencing homelessness in our community. And we actually know that because of our database system. So we actually look back in the database system 2 years prior to them coming in, and 68% of people were not in the database system 2 years prior. So what that shows, and this has been pretty consistent in our community. Most people experiencing homelessness, it is their first time experiencing homelessness. It's a episodic type of thing. However, 32% had multiple entries or multiple times that they were homeless in our system of care over the last 2 years. And so what that means essentially is that there is this relatively small cohort, about 30%, 1/3 of the total homeless population that remains homeless over time. And that's where we really need to focus a lot of our resources so that those folks can get back into housing. Because most people are able to self-resolve in many ways, homelessness. That's somewhat changing because of the housing market from the end of the pandemic. A lot more difficult for people to solve their own homelessness than it used to be. But this is an important story that I think it's really catches a lot of people off guard sometimes, is that most people, it truly is their first time ever experiencing homelessness. Something important that I want to share about the data that we saw. So we saw this very large increase in 2022 point in time count of people in shelters.
That's a big increase.
And a lot of it has to do with limited housing options. So in 2021, we looked at all the folks who were homeless who left the homeless system of care for some housing destination, which is like a positive in our books, right? They left the shelter for a housed situation. Well, 47, so just about half of all those people who left the programs left for a housing situation that was a motel that they were paying for or living with friends and family. So half of the people were able to find their own apartment, kind of get their own lease, but the other half, consequently, were not able to find their own place. And so I think that's a really important factor to show that it's a lot of this is driven by the lack of places for people to move to. And half of everybody who left our program for a house situation did so to not a permanent, not their own living situation. And that's a trend that's not encouraging in terms of, we want folks to have a solid, safe place for themselves that they can feel good about. And so that's only true for about half of people who are leaving our system last year. Also, the average length of stay in emergency shelter was 136 days, which is significantly higher than it used to be.
Much higher.
Before the pandemic, it was around 40 days, 30 to 40 days in shelter was the average. And so this average length of stay is also a clear indication of the lack of places for people to move into in our community. And so people will remain in shelter longer. And actually that, all those things combine to create a situation where there is not turnover in shelter beds because there's very few places for people to move out of shelter into housing. And so with a lack of turnover in shelter, what you get is the need to shelter more and more people, because over time, people become homeless. And if people aren't moving out of shelters properly, that means that we need to keep expanding our emergency shelter capacity to meet the need, which is what we did in 2022 over this last year to meet the need during COVID. And that's why our emergency shelter count was so high, was because one of the main factors that was driving that is the lack of turnover. And you can see that that was true in the length of stay. So in a healthier system, you have turnover in emergency shelter beds. People are able to move out of emergency shelter into housing, which leaves an open bed for someone who's becoming homeless to utilize. And so when you don't have avenues for people to move out of emergency shelter, you don't have that turnover and you don't have open beds for people to move into. And that's the situation that we've been in over this past year. Wanted to talk about chronic homelessness, which is a subset of the homeless population, relatively smaller, but the needs are quite high. And people experiencing chronic homelessness are among some of the most health-wise, some of the most vulnerable people in our community. This is the count of chronic homelessness over the past, since 2012. And you can see that it's changed a lot over time, driven by different factors. But one of the most interesting stories is the crossings opening in Charlottesville. And you can see when the crossings opened in Charlottesville in 2012, in the 2 years following that, the number of chronically homeless individuals dropped almost basically in half, from 76 down to 32, which is incredible. And it remained pretty consistent. There was a little bit of an anomaly in 2017, but you can see that chronic homelessness remained in the 30s through 2019, but then started to increase again since then. And a lot of that was driven by the pandemic as well, because we were taking in more people into shelter. And we were also prioritizing shelter beds for folks who were medically vulnerable because of, from the pandemic. We wanted to prioritize making sure that folks who are medically vulnerable, who are at increased risk of severe illness from COVID, could get access to shelter. And so that also allowed us to document chronic homelessness better, but it also meant that more people with compromised health conditions were in shelter. And so that also led to our increase in chronic homelessness. But the story here is that, permanent supportive housing programs work. You can see how clearly that is in the data, that it dropped significantly after the crossings opened. And we haven't had any increase like that of permanent supportive housing in our community since then. And so I'm very, very grateful that we do have some on the horizon with Virginia Supportive Housing's development at the Premier Circle site, which is scheduled to break ground in May of 2023. That will add to 80 new units of permanent supportive housing to our community. So that's really important, but it's, one piece to the puzzle. We need a lot more resources, a lot more housing specifically, and supportive housing to really address the need more properly. So where does this leave us with next steps? This is kind of an overview of where we at, again, or where we've been at. And again, the pandemic has had a big impact on homelessness, has had a huge impact on how we provide homeless services because we had to move towards safe, non-congregate sheltering. But the impact on the housing market has had a significant impact on the homeless population as well, and that can be really easily seen in the data. So where do we need to go? Well, we need to do both. We need to do two things in order to reach our goal of functional zero, which is when homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. And in order to do that, like I was talking about with shelter, we need to increase shelter capacity year-round because we have seasonal shelter through Pacham, but I believe that we really need to increase shelter capacity year-round to better address shelter needs in our community. And so that's one thing we're working on, and we need to focus on as a system of care. But the other thing we also need to do at the same time is really provide more opportunities for people to move out of shelter, because without that key piece to the puzzle, we would keep increasing shelter, emergency shelter capacity to keep meeting the need, because people continue to fall into homelessness over time. That is a given, and you can guarantee on that. But if we don't provide the subsequent ways for people to move out of homelessness into housing, like the permanent supportive housing development with VSH, we will unfortunately see those trend lines continue to increase, which we're seeing signs of over the last year. That's what allows us to help make sure homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. So we can't prevent people from falling into homelessness, but we can have the resources in place to help people move out quickly, and that's our goal. And so those two areas are really key. The city has supported affordable housing developments, which are significant and are going to have a huge impact on homelessness. I mean, we need more affordable housing in general in our community, and that will affect homeless services. But also we need specific tailored services, supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness, like Virginia Supportive Housing's permanent supportive housing development, for it to really get to the severe needs that we are seeing, and that a lot of people who are living outside face every day, really need special, intensive support services plus housing to address that population effectively. So those are the two areas that we're continuing to work in, is more permanent supportive housing opportunities, using existing housing in the community, but also we need new housing developed. And also we're looking to better meet shelter needs year round. So thank you again for having me talk about homelessness. It was, I appreciate this discussion, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'm not sure if we have any more time, but would be happy to answer them now or later, however it might meet your needs. So.
Yes, I just have a quick question. As this came up as a topic, I had a few people to ask me to ask the presenters about the individuals that might be at the intersections and things, asking for money, said they're homeless. They want to know if there's a way to have you all, or is there a way to reach out to them to say, yes, here is service, because, they say there's many intersections, they see the same people, and it concerns them. Sometimes they seem as dangerous, and I tell them it's really not anything that we can do, but that's something that's very visible, other than, of course, we see them the unhoused maybe sleeping, in doorways and things, but that's something that a wide range of different areas see, and not just in this community, but, it's everywhere. So are you able to speak to that any, sir?
Sure, yeah. People panhandling or asking for help is one of the most common ways that the community members kind of interact with, or let's say engage with or identify people experiencing housing insecurity or housing instability or homelessness. And so it definitely comes up a lot. I get asked a lot about it. And it is a complicated, complex issue that doesn't always, overlap 100% with homelessness. Many people who are panhandling aren't homeless by the technical definition, meaning that they are paying for themselves to stay in a hotel, or they might be staying with friends and family. And so they're not on the streets or in shelters. But some people are also in their own housing, and some people are also in housing programs, homeless service housing programs. People choose to panhandle for many different reasons. For some people, it's a social interaction activity. And for other people, they are paying to stay in a hotel that night. And so it varies widely. And we do, like I said, we do have outreach workers that are familiar with many of those individuals. There are new individuals that pop up every now and again, and that I see panhandling, and I notify our outreach team to see if they've been aware of those individuals coming through. But we stay as focused as we can in the homeless system of care on individuals experiencing literal homelessness, so they're on the streets, in their car, or in shelters. And again, panhandling doesn't always kind of overlap 100% with that cohort or that population. But it's obviously a big part to the puzzle. The interesting thing, like I said before, is that some folks who are in supportive housing still choose the panhandle, and people who are in shelters still choose the panhandle. And so it's not as clear cut just because you see it to understand the full picture behind it. I know that sounds a little bit like a non-answer.
No,
but
I understand,
it's
sir.
a complicated issue.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
It is, yeah.
Thank
And
you.
just two quick questions, because I know we do have another presentation.
I've got one too.
But just one, to clarify, is the numbers you showed us for your full service area that includes all the other counties, or was that just a point-in-time count within Charlottesville city limits? And then the second question is, did you have any data about addiction and substance abuse, or was that captured within the self-reported number for mental health issues?
Thank you. Yeah, it is included in that self-reported number for substance use issues. The other question that you had was about the kind of geography, or what do these, I guess, from where do these numbers come from geographically? And even though our service area includes those counties, we actually didn't identify anybody experiencing homelessness in any of the counties outside of Albemarle County in the city of Charlottesville. So all of those numbers all were from people identified or staying in, identified sleeping outside or staying in shelters in the city or in the county of Albemarle.
What about
Now-
place of origin?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we included a new question as a part of the survey for people living outside. So that population of folks, at 27 people will be identified living outside. We asked about where someone last had a permanent residence, and 40% of those folks said that it was not, it was not in Charlottesville, essentially, even though all of those folks we identified were in Charlottesville or the very close urban ring. So it is definitely, people move from different areas, people come to our area for opportunities, for services. And that is a real thing that happens in the general population. And, at times it definitely does happen in the homeless population as well. That was our first foray into trying to better kind of answer that question. But we did find that 40% of people self-reported as having their last permanent residence in an area that's outside of the Charlottesville area.
Outside of the Charlotte, does that include Albemarle, outside of the, when you say the Charlottesville area, I'm just trying to,
Sorry, yeah, outside of even our COC. So places like Lynchburg or Waynesboro, those kinds of places.
Okay, so not
outside of the Louisa.
40% not in the Charlottesville TJAC area.
Correct.
Okay. What about the shelter? The reason I'm asking this is not to say we shouldn't be funding stuff, just to clarify, but
Sure.
that because it's natural for people who are in a rural area who experience an emergency and that causes them to lose housing, to come to an urban area where they can walk, where there's resources. And I'm just trying to get a grip on if the things that we are doing to help eviction, prevention, et cetera, is helping. And so I'm also trying to figure out, in our emergency services, sheltering, do we have where last permanent residence was?
With most of the people we are sheltering currently, we do not ask that, but that is something that we can change. And I think there's been a lot of questions asked about that issue, over the past few years, but it's come up a lot. Anecdotally, it seems that's been changing. Anecdotally, it does seem that there's a shift in, where people are coming from. And so, we need to find more about it, but I don't have anything else really to share in terms of hard data at this point. And, but to reiterate, the sheltered numbers that you're seeing, sorry. hopefully you can't hear that, but okay, there you go. The sheltered numbers that we're talking about are all shelters in the city or in the county, in terms of the hotel programs that we work with, and Premier Circle emergency shelters also located in the county. So all of those numbers, the 260 people, are, the only shelter resources in our whole COC geography are located in the city and in the urban ring area of the county.
Right,
So
there's
like you
nothing
said,
outside
someone
of,
who's
like-
homeless in a more rural community, many do have to come here for shelter because that's the only place where shelter is in the that's closest to them.
Yeah, I think the only other there's one in Harrisonburg, there's one in Waynesboro, there's one in Fredericksburg, in Richmond.
Yeah.
Mr.
So,
Mr. Harrow, how are the shelters funded? What's the funding source for that? And a second component is the new, so we have something called the Crossings, I understand, and then there's a new facility being opened as well?
Correct.
And that's,
Yeah.
so I guess you've got a hotel program that is being paid for to sort of manage the surge of people coming and going, and then it sounds like you've got the Crossings, which is a more sort of, I guess, a bigger facility, and then you're wanting to build a new facility. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'll break that down a little bit, but
Okay.
it's a great question. So shelters are funded, at least the shelters that TJAC funds. So to be clear, these numbers do represent people staying at Salvation Army, but we do not fund Salvation Army. They do all private fundraising. We fund Pacham Shelter, and we fund Families in Crisis, which is hotel, motel vouchers for families with children. And we also fund the Premier Circle Shelter program, which is operated by Pacham as well. And we also fund other people to stay in hotels in the community to address surges over time. And so all of those are funded through the State Department of Housing and Community Development program. Their homeless and special needs housing program is where a lot of our funding for those specific shelter programs come from. We are also supported by the city and county through the Vibrant Community Fund and the ABRT programs, and also through local foundations as well. But most of the actual rent and direct kind of operational support comes from the DHCD program at the state. And a lot of the funding recently over the past couple of years for us to be able to increase our shelter capacity like we have been able to has come from a special program called CHIRP, which is the COVID Homeless Emergency Relief Program, and also from ARPA funding from both the city and county as well has been a huge funding source for our increase, over the normal amount of people we've sheltered. And so those are going away. The state COVID homeless program funding is kind of ending at the end of this calendar year. So it does, provide a big gap for us to fill in 2023. You asked about the Crossings. The Crossings is a permanent supportive housing development. So it's not a shelter. People can stay there for as long as they want to. And the permanent supportive housing development that you referenced at Premier Circle is breaking ground in May 2023, and that's by Virginia Supportive Housing. And that will, again, break ground in May 2023. It's not shelter. It's people can stay there for as long as they want to. It's best practice in homeless services. Virginia Supportive Housing, I believe the latest data was larger or higher than 95% of people who come into the program don't go back to homelessness, which is incredible. So it works, which is great. And we just frankly, we need more of it.
And is that funded by the state, the Virginia Supportive Housing?
That's funded by, Virginia Supportive Housing uses many, many different funding sources for their developments. They applied for low-income housing tax credits. I believe they received support from.
So something like PHA in terms of how it.
we gave them a lot of money.
Okay, but in other words, it's an entity like PHA.
Yeah, they're an affordable housing developer in their own right. They just focus on chronic homelessness, and the unique thing about their program is that they have on-site case management services, and they hold or they dedicate housing choice vouchers that are a part of the project, which are crucial, by the way. And we do need more housing choice vouchers dedicated to this new development. but they dedicate all those housing choice vouchers to people experiencing chronic homelessness to make sure that it's addressing people who really need it. So
21 of the city's housing choice vouchers are project-based at the crossings.
Okay.
21 or
Yep.
22, and Albemarle has the other 8 or 9.
And did
correct.
this,
The city also supplements some funding so that people only pay $25 versus the $50 minimum rent.
but this Virginia Supportive Housing, did it enter into our CIP at all, or is it part
No,
of the
they-
Affordable Housing Plan?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
I mean, the crossings was built back in 2010.
Uh-huh.
Half of it is dedicated to chronically homeless, half is dedicated to those low income,
Okay.
could be working. I have a question. How much case management is happening? I mean, how many case managers are now doing case management at the crossings?
I believe it's
And-
2, but I can follow up
2.
on that.
Okay. 2 full-time case management?
That's my understanding, yeah.
Okay. And is that how many people are expected to be living at Premier Circle?
So at in the new development that's breaking ground in 2023, it's going to be 80 units total. Now,
Okay.
Virginia Supportive Housing is, well, a lot of it depends on the number of project-based housing choice vouchers they can access. And I can speak as much as I am able to. I might be missing some of the details there, but they did receive, I think it was 22 vouchers from the county already towards that project, which is fantastic. But again, more vouchers are needed for them to reach their goal of 60 total vouchers at the Premier Circle Permanent Supportive Housing Project, which will again allow 60 individuals who may not have any income, who are experiencing chronic homelessness, to move into and live in that in those units. Without those project-based vouchers, it's still affordable housing, but it's very difficult to address those deep levels of affordability of 0 to 30%. And so those project-based vouchers are crucial to us addressing chronic homelessness.
Do you know offhand how many project-based vouchers we are, I guess, so, we can only project-base a certain percentage of our housing choice vouchers. That's, HUD says we can't do more than that because people have to be allowed to use those to move where they feel like they want to live. Do we know how many Charlottesville even has to project-base?
I'm sure someone does. I don't know that off the top of my
Okay.
head. I'll have to connect with John at CRHA about that.
Folks, we have another presentation we've got to get to.
Sorry.
Mr. Harrow, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We know where to find you if we have
Yes,
additional
yes.
questions, and you know where to find us. We appreciate your coming, and we appreciate in particular the depth of the presentation that you gave us, that I've been reading along and marking up as we go.
Well,
So-
thank you all. And,
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
again,
you.
happy to help. Thank you.
Take care.
The next presentation we have is about the Regional Emergency Communications Center and Marcus Alert 988. We have the Executive Director of the Emergency Communications Center, Sonny Saxton, with us, I think. Do we have him? Somebody got him to bring him up? Or whoever is in charge of that presentation?
Hi, Mayor Snook, can you hear me?
Yes, great, gotcha.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if you give me just a second, and I'll also, if you and the counselors would allow me, I have a presentation I'd like to use for some talking points here. So give me just a second to bring them up.
So can we get him the authority to share his presentation? There we go.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Snook, I appreciate that. So once again, my name is Sonny Saxton. I'm the Executive Director of your Emergency Services Communications Center. Today, I just want to take a few minutes and talk a little bit about how do you ensure community access to emergency services, including persons experiencing mental health crisis. So talk just a little bit about Marcus Alert and 988, if I may. Certainly stop me if you have questions, and I'll be available after as well. So when we look at the Emergency Communication Center, of course, that's your regionalized 911 center. I did want to mention that we are a consolidated center for Charlottesville, of course, and as well as Albemarle County and UVA. Not all centers in Virginia are consolidated. So that helps the community by having one phone call they can call for access. You also have regional coordinated systems. Josh Powell will speak in just a few minutes about our public safety software system and our public safety radio system. We also are the presence for the Regional Emergency Management Coordination, and you're probably most familiar with our work as the Emergency Operations Center. So we were established in 1984. We've got approximately 54 authorized FTEs with specialized skills sets. The picture there in front of you happens to be one of our last completed training or recruit classes, and so we're excited to have that. But we have those specialized skill sets to include operations and then IT, administrative, and custodial. And then I think it's important to see some pictures inside of a 911 operation, if you will. The majority of time we're interacting with the public. We're doing so, we're just the voice on the phone, right? And we're providing care until emergency responders can arrive. So you can see there that we are having some festivities, looks like, some holiday pictures. We also are a triple accredited center, which that means that we are CALEA certified, as well as APCO Project 33 and Virginia Emergency Medical Dispatch certified. And I'd like to introduce then Josh Powell. He's our manager of support services, and he's going to talk just a minute about some of the different systems that we have.
Thank you, Sonny, and good afternoon, members of council. As Sonny mentioned, I'm the support services manager here at the ECC. I've been here for going on 3 years, and I'd like to just quickly touch on a few of our core services and systems today. And it's topical because they're all designed to ensure access for our community members to get emergency services and what help they may need. We'll start off with one of the one of the largest, at least visibly, which is our public safety radio system. You see on your screen one of our towers. We manage and maintain the regional radio system that houses over 4,000 subscribers. So not only is that all of our regional public safety partners, but also things like the service authority, the school systems, and the transit systems. So in short, if you see a vehicle with a brown license plate, there's a very good chance it has one of our radios inside of it. And we're very excited to announce that we have actually just started some of the final cutover steps for a refresh of the system that will improve coverage, reliability, and functionality throughout the region. So we're expecting those steps to take a little bit of time, but will be hopefully wrapped up sometime in the fall. Next slide, please. We also house and maintain several other regional systems. As Sonny mentioned, that included our public safety software systems, or the computer-aided dispatch that we use here in the center, as well as all of our responder partners use in the field. It includes law enforcement records, as well as correction records. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about that is that it means that we have connection points throughout our community, throughout some of the agencies and jurisdictions in our area, which makes us sort of uniquely positioned to work with those groups alongside our partners in implementing big and collaborative projects like Marcus Alert. Next slide, please. So one of the most important things that you'll need to know about us is how to access us. Fortunately, that's a very easy thing to know because we have a 3-digit number, 911. Of course, for a long time now, you've been able to call 911, but as of more recently, you are also able to text us if you are unable to call us. Just a note that calling is the quickest way to get service, so if you are able to call, please do so, but if you can't, you can text. We do receive around 250,000 calls per year here in the Charlottesville UVA Albemarle Emergency Communications Center. We are proud to report that we do meet the industry standard of answering at least 90% of those calls, at least of the 911 calls, within 15 seconds. So some of those 250,000 calls are misdials or hangups. So on behalf of my colleagues who are answering the phones, I would like to just let everyone know that if you do happen to misdial 911, please do not hang up. It is important that you are able to make contact with the communications officer and let them know that there is no emergency, because otherwise they're going to keep trying to reach you to confirm that there's not an emergency. Conversely, some people don't call 911 when they probably should. So remember, if it is a medical emergency, a fire emergency, or a police emergency, please call 911. We will help make sure that you get the resources and the assistance that you need. You're not going to bother us if there really is a problem or an emergency. Just call. When in doubt, call. If you do, however, have a situation that needs access to the regional public safety services, but is definitely not an emergency, so this may be something that happened days ago or just a routine report or something like that, you can call our non-emergency number. That's there on the screen, and it will get you to the same dispatch center with the same resources. It'll only ring at a lower priority here in the center if the lines are busy. So coming soon, you'll see on the right half of your screen, there's a new 3-digit emergency number. So the benefit of this is, like 911, it is easy to remember. That number is 988. Do note that the mandate for this to be active does not go into effect until July of this year. So in the meanwhile, we also have the National Suicide Hotline there on the screen, which is currently active. But essentially, this is going to be a system that responds specifically for mental health crises. Similar to 911, you're going to be able to reach it by call or text. Next slide, please. So in addition to the community members who are able to contact us, we also initiate outgoing contacts to our community. We use a reverse 911 system called Code Red, and that allows us to send out geo-targeted messages around things like a missing persons. Often those are people that may be experiencing a mental health crisis or disability, such as Parkinson's or dementia, that result in them being at increased risk. And so we work closely with our responder partners in using that as a tool to help ensure that every resource available is applied to making sure people are safe and getting the services they need. UVA also has an alert system. The sign up for both of those alerts, the instructions for that is on your screen. Next slide, please. So in 911, just as in much of life, the only constant is change. We are constantly changing, constantly looking for ways to improve our services and make sure that we are being the best we can for the community. Some of those you'll see on your screen there include EZINet, which is making sure that we're aligned with the state in upgrading our technology and making sure we're prepared for any future technology needs. You'll see Carbine, which is video calls in the 911 center. Pulse Point, which is the picture there on your background, which is a really cool free mobile app that allows CPR-trained community members, just your average layperson, to get a notification if an active cardiac event is happening in your immediate proximity that requires CPR or AEDs. So you can respond to the scene perhaps even quicker than the responders are. Also, Priority Dispatch, which is an international standard for how we interact with callers and provide care while arranging for the responders to respond as the first responders, the people who are answering the phone and starting to manage that emergency. And then, of course, the main topic for today, which is Marcus Alert and 988, and I'll turn it back over to Sunny to tell you a little bit more about the efforts that are underway there.
Thank you, Josh. So what is Marcus Alert? Now, of course, I know that the council has received at least one, but probably more presentations over the last year on this. But for the members of the community that may be viewing and have not yet known that, I thought it'd be helpful to start with just a quick kind of definition and a highlight, if you will, that the goal of Marcus Alert, if we were to place a singular goal on it, would be to provide a behavioral health response to behavioral health emergencies. Now, there's a lot of other things that from a goal perspective, short and long term, that we hope to gain out of the system. But essentially, Marcus Alert creates that coordination between the 911 and the regional crisis centers, as well as specialized behavioral health response from law enforcement. So in Virginia, we've got several initiatives that have been underway for quite some time. So I know oftentimes as we engage in these discussions, we begin to kind of talk about these in shortcuts, if you will. So STEP Virginia requires 9 core services. The Marcus Alert we're talking about now, psychiatric hospital bed census crisis has been ongoing. So the real question is, how do we then respond to that? And the steps to response have been multiple and have spanned many years. The DBHDS, Department of Justice, obviously has a key role in this. Some would say the driving agencies, others would say, well, that driving agency may be DCJS. Comprehensive Crisis Continuum, that's the Crisis Now model that has really been talked about often. And then the 988 implementation that Josh just talked about. So from, if you will, imagine a Venn diagram, then, you know, kind of the center point of all of that is where the 911 center is. We're working with all of these different partners and have been in many ways to be able to for our component, our small component, if you will, a cog in the system, to be sure that we're providing the best access care for everyone. Interesting to note, these slides that I'm using, some of these slides I'm using today, come from a recent presentation that I was privileged to be able to moderate just a few weeks ago with most of our 911 directors and supervisors from around Virginia. Met with and worked with DCJS and Behavioral Health, Department of Baby Health, as well as PRS, Crisis Center call lines, which you'll hear me talk about that in a minute. So I say all that to say there are a lot of things going on, trying to be intentional about the work, understanding that the work is extremely, extremely important. And so I'll spend just a couple of minutes to kind of telling you a snapshot of where we're at, and certainly ask questions as we go. Just to back up a level here, physical health emergencies, start with, if you will, a person in crisis, call 911, have emergency care, and then perhaps even an inpatient unit. This slide that was courtesy of Fairbanks several years ago, I think really sets the stage for how we want to treat behavioral health emergencies. We want to be able to identify that person quickly get them on the line with the crisis call center, deliver a team to their side, and or get them, if they're mobile, to a 23-hour stabilization center, and then have short-term stabilization and on from there. To me, what's striking is just a recent headline I pulled just even a couple of weeks ago, shows that approximately 10% of American adults ages 18 and over will suffer from a depressive illness in the next year. And so that 1 in 10, if you will, it just shows us that the time is long past for us to deal with these behavioral health emergencies effectively, and to understand that it can happen to any of us. So with that said, on your screen here is a rather busy graphic that's actually been around for a little while. This helps set the stage for what we're working with Marcus Alert. We're really looking at what we call Intercept 0 and Intercept 1, which is how people access emergency services, and that's that coordination between a crisis center, the crisis care continuum, 911, and local law. And really, that's where the meat of the work, if you will, has been happening for the last several months. So there's many different elements to transforming these systems. Some of them, as you know, are going to take many years. Today, and in my conversation, I'm focusing just on the crisis call centers. So really kind of rooting that in the 911 discussion, if you will, understanding that there are many other components to this. And I know even some of our people that are in attendance today, as well as counselors themselves, have experience with this. But I would say that when it comes to 988, being the new short code, if you will, to emergency services for mental health crises, is really it's that no wrong door approach. In other words, you can call any of those. You call 911, you can call 988, you can call the suicide hotline. And the idea is that you would have a complete continuum of care no matter where you access it. There is a level of screening that needs to occur, and I'll talk about that in just a second. The call centers, though, who you're talking to outside of the 911 centers, so this would be the 988 crisis centers, would be staffed by licensed clinicians, peers, and volunteers. And they already are. I'll talk about that in just a second. 8 out of 10 calls are anticipated to be resolved over the phone. So really you're talking about 20% that require a mobile crisis team. So that's that co-responder model. So in the co-responder model, I know we've talked about in the past, is really pairing up those resources that may not have been responding together before. They were working together, but not been responding together before. And that would be local law, mental health, behavioral health, emergency trained people, as well as perhaps EMS. And so when you put that group together and deploy those into the community, really that can help perhaps begin that emergency care treatment at the person's side, and then work on getting them to a crisis stabilization unit and to a hospital or an inpatient care if needed. Like I mentioned before, there are 2 call center vendors that currently provide coverage for the state. One is called Frontier Health, that's not in our region, and PRS is already operating in the regions around us, but not yet for Charlottesville and Lamar County. So here's just a patchwork quilt, if you will, of the Marcus Alert pilot programs that are already underway. And not to discredit or take away from the work that's already underway, but you see this as a really a question of where you live. So a year later, if you happen to live in an area that's already had the implementation round 1, perhaps you might have better access to emergency care than if you live in one of the other regions. From where we are today to arrive at a point where all of this is colored in is really quite a long time. Now, initially in the legislation, I think there is a plan, if you will, or a hope, if you will, to arrive at a full colored map within a short time frame, within just a couple of years. But really, from what we're hearing in the state and we're hearing from our colleagues, that road's traveled is going to take a lot longer. So what does that planning roadmap look like, and where are we at in that? So you may recall last year, for a considerable portion of the year, we met routinely with all members, stakeholders, including, very importantly, persons with lived experience. And we formed that local team. We began talking about what are these next steps. Last time that we presented to the council, we talked really about, the missing component is research, is understanding our local community. We have some state research that was presented and collected about 1.5 years or 2 years ago, and then presented last year. But really, at some point, we need that local research as well. And then, of course, we've got to get the community input and then build that plan. So to focus this on the 911, 988 discussion then. Not going to go through this busy slide, but this is an example of triaging those complaints as they come in, or concerns that our community members might have about somebody, or even that perhaps they're calling for themselves. And how then do we go from something that might be routine to something that might be urgent? So what you see here is an artifact or evidence that this process is being built. These are kind of fresh, hot off the press things that have been built over the last 6 to 9 months. We're continuing to tweak them almost daily. Recently, I was fortunate last week to meet with, so myself and my team members met with some national level liaisons, if you will, and really began to talk about what is the right way to engage somebody that's having a mental health emergency. In fact, we begin to talk about an international program or protocols, international protocol updates that include things like when you're talking to a caller, make sure that if they are expressing harm, wanting to do harm to themselves, distance them from whatever that might be. So if they're holding a knife, put the knife down, get them away from it. And those are things that you would think would be just practical advice that you would give somebody. But understanding that needs to be trained at our communications officer level. They need to have a clear understanding of that. They need to be confident in the directions that they're giving to the callers. That type of interaction really is a ground up training effort, not just in our emergency centers in Virginia, but throughout the nation. So really we're looking at this from a national perspective and beginning to redefine what that protocol looks like. And then as that's very topical now, then how would you dispatch co-responders? How would you communicate with them? How do you keep them safe when they're in the field and doing their jobs? So then just to think a little bit about next steps here. So as we look at the timeline, and this is probably a slide that you've seen before, this comes from a toolkit that the Department of Behavioral Health Services has given to the localities for planning. Really, we begin to kind of measure ourselves. We're looking in the time period of December to July 2022, and going down the list and saying, yes, okay, we're starting to do that. We're starting to do that. We know that the state of Virginia, or the Commonwealth of Virginia, was really looking to implement full implementation, begin second round selections in the next few months. They might very well do that. I'm hopeful. However, it's a long, long road to be able to implement them. I liken some of these things to when 911 was beginning as a short emergency code, that it took many years to develop the technology, the training, to make sure that it was a ubiquitous service, that everybody rural and metro had access to it. This will be something like that. And the analogy we often hear is that it's building a plane as it's in the air, or we're building it as we're driving down the road. And that's said not to trivialize it, but that's said to say we're very intentional about this work and we're making sure it's done right. Now we do know that that the telephone companies have to get that short code set up by July of 2022, so July of this year. So that will go active. But what we're hearing from some of the national advocacy programs like SAMHSA and International Academy of Emergency Dispatch is that the outreach, the program outreach, the public relations, community relations models will be delayed until after the first of the year. So I don't think you're going to see a hard press for 988 usage until at least January of 23. And likely thereafter, because they're trying to give some more time and space for these technologies to be worked out. At the local level, what are we doing locally? Well, my takeaways are that the protocols for the 911 and 988 are still in development and will be for some time. Our international standard setting agencies are still trying to get it right and make sure that we do the right thing for the right people, the right time. The technology coordination I just mentioned is underway. But my number one takeaway, and I may have already said it, is that these things are going to take time. The timelines are great to try to look at, but we're many, many months, if not years out from this being completed. There is new legislation that has worked its way through the state or Commonwealth of Virginia. Some of that made it to the governor's desk. I'm not tracking all of it this week. I need to go back and see where we are. But that also will alter the landscape of the Marcus Alert. And I'll probably just leave it at that. So with that, I open myself up to questions. I wonder if there's anything else I can help tell the counselors about, but I certainly appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Sexton.
Thank you. I have two questions. I know you said, it's going to take time and it's months, if not years out, but do you have any kind of a sense of a rough estimate of a timeline or a goal for a timeline? And then connected to that, in the map you showed, there are some regions which have either gotten to step 1 or step 2 of implementing the Marcus Alert system. What factors have led them to be able to be at that point versus us not being at that point? And are the barriers around staff capacity, level of investment into it? Just help me get a better sense of what's driving those differences.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Councilor. I'll start in reverse, if I may. Very well said that there are certainly barriers. I may not have highlighted it well, but the graph that I showed, the pilot programs, those were actually selected by the state. So they are on track of where they wanted them to be as far as a pilot program. Our area wasn't, Charlottesville and Albemarle County wasn't part of the initial pilot. However, the Region 10 overall does have some crisis hub responsibilities that they're working on. And of course, I'll leave that to them to talk about what they're doing. But as far as barriers, absolutely. But I would say that there is no lack of people intentioned about the work, that is about the best way to say it. The staffing constraints are there. The ability to stand up crisis centers is there. Our emergency departments may not be able to handle the entire load. And then where do the patients go ultimately in order to get definitive treatment, stabilizing treatment, and then reintegrate them back into the community? And so those are all very, very tall orders. And I know you know all of that, of course. But that was a great question. So that's why we're not necessarily behind on our timeline. We just weren't one of the pilot areas.
And just quickly, in the next steps, it mentions the state selecting second round of areas for implementation of the Marcus Alert system. Is there anything that we can do to best position ourselves to be chosen for that? Because I know that timeline is December 2021 to July 2022.
So I've asked that question myself. So I'm working closely with Department of Behavioral Health Services. We've got, in fact, I was on a call today with them where we were talking about, again, my corner of the work is specific to 911 and 988, and how do we roll out this communication and this training to our 911 centers in Virginia. But I was on a call today where we were talking about building that coalition. So in the frame set of where we are and how far it's going to take us to get there, consider that in some stages, they're just now building the coalition to train the 911 centers, which are key to that coordinated crisis network, if you will. And so that's certainly a challenge that we're just now at that level in the state. So I don't know when they're going to select those, but that was a question certainly I asked. I said, what do we need to do to be ready? Of course, they referenced the slide, but what specifically can my community do to be able to take a step forward and lean in? And of course, we're doing that in some respects, we're leaders in the discussion, but it's hard when you have so many open questions to really claim to be out front or be a leader when there's so many things that are undone.
Certainly, I'd just say, I definitely want to do everything that we are able to do as City Council to help position ourselves to be chosen sooner rather than later. And in addition, also position ourselves to enter into the kind of partnership with Region 10 that Albemarle recently entered into. And so certainly anything that we can do as City Council and City Government to help with that, I definitely want to support that.
Well, thank you, Councilor. If I may, I'll certainly pass along the sentiments to the colleagues that are on the planning team with us. So thank you.
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, I would second those comments from Councilor Payne. Would you say that the overall project, this is a really large project, is what it is in essence, is being sort of driven or managed centrally out of DBHDS? Who's sort of, I get that, or I take it that it is a partnership in terms of localities stepping up and working or regions stepping up and working. So there is some give and take, but who has the ultimate sort of driver for this, the sponsor, so to speak? Is it within DBHDS?
Thank you, Counselor. So the stated, when I asked that question in Virginia to some of our leaders in, say, 911 at VDEM, or I asked DCJS, they are pointing us to DBHDS.
Okay.
However, many of these things are very centric to DCJS. We can only do as much as we're legally allowed to do in some of these conversations that we get into, of course, right? So we're immediately looking back to one of our core partners, DCJS, saying, okay, how do we make this happen? This is what we need to do. How do we make it happen? And I sense some discoordination, perhaps is too strong of a word, but I sense some work still underway to build those coalitions between the state government agencies that are able to move these. But you're right, it's a massive project, and but clearly everyone that I've interacted with, I've not had anybody say don't do it, somebody say they don't get it. Everybody gets it. It's a question of who's leading it. But right now, on record, it's DBHDS.
And maybe this is not an appropriate question to ask you, and if it's not, I'm sorry, but in terms of the enabling legislation that it takes to, behind the scenes and make all this work, is your sense that that's still sort of, that cake is still being made and baked, or is it in the oven now, or what sort of place in that particular analogy can you locate us?
Well, you're right. I'm not best positioned to answer that.
Okay.
I would certainly be one of your legislative liaisons, but I also sympathize or empathize, if you will, with the idea of trying to make what is an extremely complex program and put an analogy to it. Not to trivialize what we're talking about, but just because there's so many steps in it, we're trying to understand where we're at. Well, I'd say we're on the rebake. Because we're going back in and looking. It's not a we. Let me be clear. It's the legislators in the state or the Commonwealth of Virginia have looked at it again and are continuing to mold that over time.
Okay.
And that's a sign to me that that when you take somebody like myself, that's very much an operational level person. That's a sign that we've got a lot of steps to go. Now, that said, of course, we're not sitting still because we're a regional center. We've got many partners that we're working with. We've got to be out front. And so, but yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to answer that question.
Yeah, thank you.
Any questions? Okay, I just have one question. I mean, I know that this is something that has been on the horizon for a while. In fact, Mr. Saxton and Councilor McGill and I were all on a group last year trying to take some first steps towards some of this. And I know that a lot of folks in the community want very much for there to be as many opportunities as possible for there to be a non-police response to a mental health crisis. Is there anything that can be done before we would get to the full implementation of the Marcus Alert System? Any sort of first steps that we can be taking that might, just right now with 911, somebody calls 911, it's apparent that it's a mental health response, be able to trigger some kind of a mental health response from the government. Anything we can be doing right now to make that happen?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Snook, and I do appreciate having your leadership as well as Councilor McGill's on our work, many work meetings last year. I know at some points it was almost weekly or bi-weekly that we're meeting. And yes, there is. And so some things have already happened. For one, if you do call 911 today within the Charlottesville, Albemarle, UVA region, the call is answered by a communications officer that has received additional training. It's not just training, and I know training may seem like that's not necessarily the final to do, if you will, but they'll answer the phone using guidance from a National Academy protocol, so a new standard. They will do so quickly, get you on the line with somebody that can stay on the line until law enforcement gets there. They're also trained in how they're going to dispatch the law enforcement, so they're very careful about what information they give over the phone, over the radio, to set the correct tone. So that is all training that's underway, that's already happened. Additionally, people today can call the 911 center non-emergency line and inform us that they have a mental health care plan. And so if you tell us, and that's essentially what the Marcus Alert voluntary database is, if you report to us or to Region 10 that you have a mental health care plan, we can notify law enforcement if for some reason they're on your way. So imagine for a minute, and this is a scenario that we hear within the Emergency Communication Center. I've also, Mayor Snook will remember that we heard this as a lived experience that was shared with us during that time last year during our early planning sessions. But if, for instance, you're calling because your family member is experiencing a mental health emergency, you're desperately worried about their well-being, and you call 911, again, we're going to answer it using international standards. We're going to give care over the phone. But if we've been informed ahead of time that you have a mental health, that person has a mental health plan, we can then notify the law enforcement officers that that plan exists. That entry point to that can either come through our non-emergency line, or you can certainly work with Region 10, and they've been doing that for some time. And I'm sure there are other things that are top of mind, so I apologize. I probably should have been a little bit more prepared for what we are already doing. But yeah, you're right. We've been working on this for a while, and the communities has already invested in some of these tools.
I appreciate the efforts that you have been taking without just waiting for the direction from the top, because that's important, and our folks need it and they want it. It's now about 20 of 6. Any last questions for Mr. Saxton? Mr. Saxton, thank you very much for your time and for all your efforts in this area.
Thank you, Mayor Snook and councilors. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So the next item on our agenda is to go into a closed session. Is there anybody you've got the motion?
I have the motion.
All right.
Pursuant to section 2.2-3712 of the Virginia Code, I hereby move that the City Council close this open meeting and convene within a closed meeting. Pursuant to Virginia Code section 2.2-3711A3, for discussion or consideration of the acquisition of real property within the city for public purpose, and of the proposed disposition of publicly held property where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the city's bargaining position or negotiation strategy. Pursuant to Virginia Code 2.2-3711A1, for discussion or consideration of the assignment, appointment, or performance of the city manager and chief of police. Pursuant of Virginia Code section 2.2-3711A7, for consultation with legal counsel regarding Seville case number CL21-610, pending in Charlottesville Circuit Court, where such consultation or briefing in open meeting would adversely affect the negotiating or litigating posture of the city. Pursuant to Virginia Code section 2.2-3711A8, for consultation with legal counsel regarding matters relating to possible action by City Council pursuant of Virginia's Code section 63.2-314, for the provision of assistance to low and moderate income homeowners.
Second.
Okay. Let's see. I guess we can just do this by voice vote, I guess. If I'm looking at the instructions here, all in favor of going into closed session, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that motion passes. Council is now in closed session. We will return to this link for the open meeting at roughly 6:30.
There's a separate link.
I'm sorry?
There was a separate link.
There is a separate link, okay. Separate link then, and we'll see folks back at 6:30. Thank you.